Tamley, I appreciate that. Yes, and thank you again. Good morning to all our colleagues and friends who are joining us for the first time. As Tamlin has mentioned, we are very, very much honored to have you join us and be able to participate in this session. And hopefully it will be the first of the many that you'll be joining us every month as per your schedule. If your schedule can allow you to wake up on a very early morning on a Saturday, the last Saturday of every month, and learn with us. We are very much a very learning network, and we do appreciate the opportunity we have to share our experiences, get to hear new things that are happening in the field of M&E, as well as sharing our own work that might in one way or another inspire all of us to be better M&E practitioners. And so having said that, we're also very privileged to have Dr. Charline Mouton joining us this morning and sharing with us a contribution she made to one of our books that we published last year. And we thought that's really very important approach to performance management in government. And we just creating an opportunity for as many of us can be able to interact with that content and even get inspired and spark hope for our government that the things can still be done right. And we are the people who can make it right when we're in the right spaces at the right time and do what we need to do. So Dr. Charline will give us more details about that approach and the work and how it came about. And hopefully for those who are from the KZN MEL, you have had a chance to read through the chapter. But if you haven't, you will hear from her directly. And then, as Tamlin said, please free to use our chat box to drop in your questions and thoughts there. And then when we get to the Q&A session, we're going to reflect on some of those and give Dr. Charline an opportunity to respond to them. So before I hand over to Dr. Charline to go ahead with the presentation, I would like to read her short bio. And this is how it is. So Dr. Charline's involvement in tracking the effectiveness of programs commenced in 2006 when she shifted from investment banking to pursue her newfound interest in monitoring and evaluation. She subsequently completed a PGD in M&E, that is postgraduate diploma in M&E in 2006, and a Master of Philosophy in Social Science Methods in 2010, and her PhD in Evaluation Studies in 2021 at the University of Stellenbosch. Dr. Charline has been exposed to various M&E environments, with her most recent role being the Performance Director in a consultancy called Strategy Execution Advices. Prior to this, she worked in the Delivery Support Unit based in the Western Cape Department of the Premier. Dr. Charline has also previously led the development of the Green Economy Strategy in the Western Cape Province, and she has worked in the M&E unit in the Western Cape Department of Economic Development and Tourism. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Charline, welcome.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and it's really great to be with you this morning. So thank you for this opportunity. Also, just to say that on the call today are my two colleagues, Belinda Wood and Jenny Cargill. So all three of us worked in the Delivery Support Unit in the Western Cape Government. So they're joining this call, and in the discussion time, I've asked them to add in, when there's questions of relevance to them, and also, of course, to maybe bring a different perspective than I would necessarily coming from the performance tracking background. So yes, I prepared a few slides. I'm going to share that, and I'm going to try my best to stick to the 15-minute time allocation. Let's see how it goes. And then, of course, as suggested by Paul, please do put your comments in the chat box, and we can come back to that at the end. So I'm going to keep my camera on, but just to let you know that my presentation is on a screen to the right. So I will be looking at that screen, and I hope that's all right. So our agenda for this morning is basically to just introduce the delivery approach, or Deliverology, as it is also referred to as we applied it in the Western Cape Government. I'm going to touch very briefly on the effectiveness of the approach and what we achieved. There's much more to say about that, but I'll keep that section very brief, because I think of interest to you would be the challenges and just the lessons that we learned from instituting this approach in the government. And then, of course, my very particular role in monitoring the game changes and just how we've gone about it within the context of the delivery approach. So the first section, really just introducing Deliverology. And I think this slide will resonate with those of you who are in government or have worked with government, because, you know, delivery in government is difficult. And the reason for that are just some of those sticky problems that I show on this slide. The fact that government is really just rules and compliance driven, with compliance sometimes becoming a purpose in itself. Of course, the whole issue of the bureaucracy being extremely large, hierarchical, just many layers to navigate through, you know, obviously hinders any kind of quick response to delivery. And then the issue of risk averse, and that innovation is really challenging to execute in government. There is this tendency to really be, you know, to not make decisions that really just hold back implementation and achieving results. Then, of course, the silo mentality, and sometimes one feels that disconnect from the real world and the realities and what the citizens are experiencing on the ground. And very often what you find in government is that the issues of structure, you know, how the organization or government is structured comes before strategy, that institutional structures are put in place, but that it doesn't then allow for strategy to be executed seamlessly. So all of this just puts government on the back foot in terms of being able to respond effectively to the challenges faced by society and our citizens. So we know that delivery is a priority in South Africa. You know, our president has immediately after the elections in 2019 have signaled that implementation should become a priority and has been critical to his reform agenda. Some of you will also be familiar with Operation Vulindlela, who really was established with the purpose of bringing a stronger delivery approach into government. Also, you know, if you look back to 2010, when the outcomes-based approach was introduced into government, and just from my literature review on my thesis, you could pick up some of those delivery elements in the way that they approached, the presidency approached the outcomes-based approach in government. One could see from my literature review, you know, that there were actually visits to the UK to investigate this delivery approach, and one can see some of those principles featuring in the way that the outcomes approach came together. But ultimately, if you look at the delivery approach in its entirety, it really was only in the Western Cape government so far that the delivery approach has been fully adopted. And that was, of course, under the premiership of Helen Zille. And the way that it was done is that there was a very strong focus on 6 strategic priorities. A delivery unit was established, and that was the unit that we were part of, with dedicated staff that worked alongside the departmental staff. And it really introduced a new way to delivery that wasn't in the government before. So I'm going to cover first just an overview of the 6 priorities before delving a little bit into the historical roots of Deliverology. So on this slide, you can see our 6 strategic priorities in the Western Cape government that was implemented between 2015 and 2019. You can see the energy security one right there at the top of the slide, which really was all around an energy secure Western Cape government. And a lot of the work, by the way, that was done in this game changer has been taken on at national government level. So for us, this was a huge success. Even if we didn't have a lot of influence over energy in the province, we worked closely with the City of Cape Town and all the municipalities in the Western Cape to just bring about change in terms of a sustainable and low carbon economy. Then, of course, our technical and vocational skills game changer. This one was firmly located in the Western Cape Government Department of Economic Development. They were already running an apprenticeship program. So this game changer kind of seamlessly integrated to the work that was done in that particular program. But it was all about targeting 5 economic sectors in the Western Cape and getting more apprentices, to take up opportunities and ultimately become available to meet the needs of those priority sectors. Our after-school game changer and our e-learning game changer were very much focused on education. After-school programs, of course, if you look at the literature, strong evidence suggesting that after-school programs can really improve learner outcomes, not just academically, but of course, also in terms of social skills, kind of a broader, just more positive outcomes for the learner as they progress, post-school. So there we were looking at our low-fee schools and really introducing more variety in terms of after-school programs, and we had huge successes in this particular game changer in terms of regular and consistent participation of learners. Then e-learning, this was our most systemic game changer of all. This was the one that I focused on in my PhD in terms of just unpacking what it meant to execute this game changer at a systemic level in 1,500 public ordinary schools in the Western Cape. And really it was about enhancing teaching and learning. And then our alcohol harms reduction game changer focused on very specific areas in the Western Cape, Khayelitsha, Gunya and Paarl East, looking at reducing alcohol-related harms. And then we had a big better living model game changer that was infrastructure related, and very much focused on project management and ensuring the development of a model for mixed income multi-use residents that addresses the apartheid legacy, but within a really very, very strict timeline. So those were our 6 priorities. And then just transitioning into what the delivery approach is really at a basic level. It was actually introduced in the UK in the early 2000s by Sir Michael Barber, working with the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair to address some of the implementation challenges. So really, what was identified at that stage is that there's this huge imbalance between policy development versus policy implementation, with often a lot of time spent on developing policy, but very little time spent actually implementing that policy. And really that work in the UK government led to this Deliverology approach, which by the way has since been taken up by many governments and even other organizations outside of government. And that footprint has just expanded globally in terms of the delivery approach, not just being confined to government. So really the emphasis was on getting results to citizens fast and to focus on what was most important. So the delivery approach in essence is a leadership response. This is really important. The leadership decides that this is an approach we want to take on. And it's all about agreeing the results upfront, building in accountability for those results, using real-time data, so monitoring continuously whether you are on track, and if there are blockages, not to wait years to resolve it, but to actually address those timeously and being very focused on solutions. And the institutional mechanism used to institute the delivery approach are then delivery units. They're sometimes called something else. In Canada, they're called the results and delivery unit. Different countries have named these units differently, but they are mostly established to be located in the center of government, although you do see different permutations of delivery units when you look across the board. So, we always say that the delivery approach is a science and an art. We like to refer to it as the alchemy of delivery, because basically we're saying that all of these elements need to work together to get the best results. So it's an art in the sense that you are curating many different elements and ensuring that all of those elements fit well together. So on this graphic, you can see those many elements. It's around setting ambitious goals, clear outcomes. It's leadership commitment that needs to come into play. It's about capable teams being involved in the implementation. It's about the routines, the stock takes that you have. It's the performance tracking and making sure that you've got data that encourages well, data that actually gives you clear vision in terms of, where action needs to be taken, not just high-level data, but really granular data. It is strategic clarity. It requires innovation. So all of these elements need to work together in order for results to be achieved. But of course, it is also a science in the sense that you do rely quite heavily on your routines and the quality of your evidence in making sure that you can make evidence-based decisions. So just to be very clear, it's not only about good project management or even a sound M&E system, even though they are part of the toolkit. But in fact, delivery should be seen as this bigger whole of all these various elements coming together in a uniform manner. So just in terms of the historical roots of deliverology, I drew on Osborne's periodization of public sector regimes in just looking at where does deliverology come from. And if you look at the three main public sector regimes from the beginning of the 1900s all the way through to the 2000s, Osborne distinguishes three big regimes. The first one is the public administration, which stretches from the beginning of the 1900s to around the 1980s. Then, of course, came the new public management, which goes from the 1980s to 2000. And then after that, the new public governance regime started. And the particular traditions of interest to deliverology, if you look within the public sector landscape, was of course the performance measurement tradition as well as policy implementation. And if you kind of study the features of each of these traditions, you can see how deliverology is clearly located within the new public governance regime, but also drawing heavily on the new public management. Because of that managerial influence, the strong emphasis on performance measurement. But from a new public governance perspective, definitely the fact that there was this recognition that implementation, if you really wanted to be successful with your results, implementation couldn't just be done by government. You needed to go outside of government, pull in other partners, other people to ensure that implementation was done effectively. Of course, from a policy implementation perspective, as I said, it became much more broader under the new public governance regime. And that's why with deliverology, you can see that kind of overlapping features with both the performance measurement tradition of the NPG and then the policy implementation, as I've just described. So there at the top of the slide, just some of the key principles or elements of each of these regimes. But really just to say that deliverology, being an NPG, but being kind of located within NPG, one can see this also from the literature, the fact that delivery units are recognized as one of the mechanisms by which these cross-cutting priorities are often tackled, recognizing the fact that you've got this very much horizontal dimension to implementation that didn't happen before. So in a nutshell, if you look at delivery and what it means, this analytical framework provides quite a nice step-by-step breakdown to describe the delivery approach. And you can see the 5 steps here on the slide. It really is starting with the foundation for delivery, where you would look at your goal statement, you would review the current state of delivery within that government that you are working in. You would build your delivery unit, you would establish a guiding coalition, which basically means that you would round up some supporters for the delivery approach. And that moves you into the second step, which is really understanding the delivery challenge, looking at past and present performance of the priorities you are interested in, and potentially doing a root analysis as well as part of that step. Then you start getting into the planning phase where you develop your reform strategy. We referred to it as a roadmap. We develop roadmaps for our priorities. The development of indicators is in italics for a reason. We added that to our approach, and I'll elaborate a bit more on that. That wasn't part of the original framework. You would draw delivery chains, which is really just a simplistic way of clarifying who are all the players in your delivery chain if you want to move from where you are today to where you want to be in future. And then, of course, it's about targets and trajectories being established to see where you're going with your priorities. Then you would start driving delivery really hard. And a key element of this step is the establishment of those routines, or as we refer to it as stock takes, that really involved your executive and administrative leadership, convening frequently, in our case, every 2 months, to assess our progress, but also to problem solve around kind of persistent delivery challenges. And really this step is important in just sustaining and continually building the momentum. And then, of course, a cross-cutting step, which is all the while you're doing steps 1 to 4, is that you want to try and create an irreversible delivery culture within your government. So for our delivery unit in the Western Cape, we took that analytical framework, and for us, it meant actually an emphasis on the 4 Ps, which was prioritization, people, performance, and problem solving. And on the slide, I'm not going to talk through each of these. You can see what that meant for us and how we made that approach of delivery our own. But really, our emphasis on priorities, be specific about what you want to achieve. The people being probably, if you had to single out the most critical element of this approach, is the people. It's the leadership behind the approach, having capable teams, and then, of course, a delivery unit that is located in close proximity to the political lead. So our delivery unit was set up in the office of the Premier with direct contact to the Premier. And that for us really made the world of difference in terms of the successes we achieved. Then the performance element, of course, the routines that I spoke about, but also the roadmaps, which were really clear and specific in terms of what we wanted to achieve. And then, of course, building those data systems and processes to support the work in being able to track our progress. And then just the problem-solving element that I'm not going to elaborate on. So just at a glance, showing you what we've achieved in the 4 years. So on the e-learning front, really we were able to very successfully roll out to 1 million learners in the province, various levels of digital access. As I said, that was our biggest game changer. This is just one of the kind of key headline results. A lot more was achieved that I'm not going to cover here. After school, we really increased by 480% learners' attendance in after-school programs. And that's against the parameters of consistent and regular attendance, and not just learners attending once a week or periodically, but really consistent attendance, so we can get those results for the learners. Our apprenticeship program, we had a target of just over 11,000. We reached that target. Alcohol-related harms, really seeing a 20% increase in sense of safety from the Khayelitsha community, and that downward trajectory of contact crime as well. And then our better living model, which, if you are on Twitter, you might have seen this, but really just a huge success in getting that financial closure in a record time. And then our energy security game changer, which had a very ambitious target around solar PV uptake that we've achieved, tremendous results with. So just some of the challenges and maybe the lessons learned, because all of this can sound very easy to implement, and that was not the case. So there's many challenges to instituting a delivery approach, and I think if governments do decide to take this on, they should be very mindful of the resource requirements of such an approach and what it actually takes to really drive delivery in this specific way. So just on the prioritization front, immediately when we started out, we were faced with the issue of how difficult it is for government to prioritize. Because, government is really faced with many things they need to do, and to ask them to prioritize was really challenging. But ultimately, the way you deal with this is that leadership must make the decisions. And in terms of the game changers, of course, our provincial cabinet approved the strategic priorities. And I think just in hindsight, we could have probably spent a bit more time looking at almost a delivery readiness to tackle those priorities, because obviously with things like energy, we had very limited influence as a province, and it just meant a lot of effort needing to go into building relationships with our municipalities, with national government, with the city of Cape Town. And those are things that I think if we knew that from the beginning, we might have maybe relooked or revisited some of our priorities, or at least have been a little bit more clear on what we were taking on. So a delivery readiness, I think, is some of the things that we could have done or spend a bit more time on. Then in terms of the people, if you don't have the leadership commitment, it makes it so much more difficult. So in terms of the Premier, we had 119 stock takes over the 4 years, or actually 121, and she only missed 2. So 119 of those stock takes went ahead as scheduled. We really worked hard at getting the minister's commitment, getting the heads of departments commitment. And that was definitely a journey, because with some of them, the commitment came very quickly, and you could immediately see the traction and momentum behind the implementation. Whereas for those game changers where there was resistance, it took longer to get going. And I think that is something that is really important to understand with this approach. Of course, the dedicated teams took a while to institute, and then of course the delivery unit itself. We were ultimately 13 people in the delivery unit, but also went through your normal challenges of getting the right people, and ultimately, that took about 1.5 years to really settle down with a fixed team in the delivery unit. So yeah, I think also just to make the comment here that with delivery, you really need a can-do attitude from your people. You have to be pragmatic, but also really say, we can do this. We can actually find solutions to the problems. On the performance tracking side, we always laugh about this a little, because government does have a lot of data, and people will say, yes, we've got this data. But when you start looking at the kind of data that gets produced, it's not data for action. It's not data that allows you to really go and get quite specific about where to intervene. So we really, in the Gamechangers, spent a lot of time and effort instituting data systems that gave us granular data. So in the e-learning, we had data at a learner level, at a teacher level, at a school level, that allowed us to intervene very specifically when a challenge was experienced. And that was the case in all our Gamechangers. So the data itself is a very important element, and being at the outset already mindful of the resources this will take, the capabilities that will be required. I think is something that anyone taking on this approach needs to be mindful of. The whole issue of an outcomes-based approach, having been in government myself for quite a while, yes, there's outcomes in your annual performance plans, and there's of course this big move towards an outcomes-based approach, but government officials still struggled with formulating clear outcomes, how to measure outcomes. So we really spent significant time with the teams. There were stages, I think, that we were literally running workshops on outcomes for 6 months on end, just to get our roadmaps to include clear outcomes. So that really is something that one should consider. Then, of course, on the problem-solving side, I already spoke about just a little bit of the inflexibility sometimes in government. The fact that you've got your plans and you need to stick to that. Whereas in the delivery approach, it really is about learning as you go. And we also had to course correct, especially in our alcohol harms reduction Gamechanger. We ended up calling this our test kitchen approach, because we tried so many different things, and only in this kind of delivery approach we were given that flexibility to try different things and to be quite flexible and innovative. So I know that this is a challenge for governments, because you do get quite fixed into your your kind of medium-term budgeting, planning, and all of that. But having this space carved out to try new things, I think was really invaluable for government. And also just the issue of risk averse, we really set up our stock take routines for it to be a space of constructive discussion. So definitely honest conversations happening, but never being punitive or being putting people in difficult positions. Really creating a kind of space where the ultimate aim was to resolve problems. So if there's an issue with a red traffic light, to say, well, what is the problem here? Why is this not getting done? So I think we were quite successful in creating a routine that didn't make officials feel exposed or being kind of negative in the way that routine was run. So just some of the other lessons I think that we really found from our own work was this issue of feet on the ground and the fact that officials don't always go outside of their offices. So in the e-learning Gamechanger, once again, we were really experiencing huge challenges in just getting good broadband access into the schools. And our data was just showing us that we were not having, that the schools really battling with the access, to connectivity. And what happened then was that the Premier decided she was going to visit schools. And with our Centre for E-Innovation, actually visited schools to find out where are the problems and how to resolve it. So data is one way of showing the issues, but the feet on the ground we found is a strategy we could have probably employed earlier on. So just in terms of monitoring then the Gamechangers, and of course this is where my PhD was very much focused on how we adjusted the delivery approach to fit our context. And I think, that's always the challenge with these first world country solutions, is that, you have to adjust it for the context that you're working in. And on the performance tracking side, we made quite a bit of adjustments to this 5-step analytical framework. And that is in fact in the chapter I did, as the one that Paul referred to, as well as my PhD. But overall, just at a high level, is really what I've done is introduced the program evaluation, or M&E principles, into the Deliverology approach. So you can see in red the elements that was adjusted to reflect our context, because also South Africa has got a strong M&E culture in government. We've got our terminology, M&E is not new to government. So we had to adjust it so that people could associate almost this approach with their own work and not see this as something completely different from what they've been doing all these years. But really just some of the changes we made was obviously using the theory of change to distinguish very clearly the different levels of outcomes, short, medium, and long term. Because what you could find as a risk in government is that the emphasis is often on the longer term outcomes, and then you think that you're not successful with what you're doing because you're not considering the fact that over the short term maybe you are making a difference, and you need to be a little bit more patient before you will see the change over the long term. So we were monitoring short and medium term outcomes in the Gamechanger, showing in fact that we were on the right track with the implementation of our programs. Another change or addition we made was just using the logic model when developing the roadmap. So very clearly distinguishing or illustrating, the link between activities and our outcomes, so that we knew that we were, we're developing programs that were well conceptualized and well designed. The issue of indicators was interesting. So in the Deliverology approach, they suggest using a few key indicators to track the performance of the priorities. But just in the context of what we were working with, there weren't a lot of existing indicators to draw on. A lot of these programs were new, and some of the interventions we were taking on, didn't have established indicators. So we introduced a step of developing our own indicators, and that meant that we had to institute quite a bit of new data collection. The issue of targets and trajectories, again, the Deliverology approach prescribes or suggests setting quite ambitious targets. And in our instance, because we were obviously tracking outcomes, we didn't in all instances have or could set targets from the outset. When you are tracking outcomes for the first time, we said we're not setting a target at this stage. We're waiting for the baseline or the first measurement before we set targets. So for us, it was important to say that we'll set targets where appropriate, and that of course was often on the output side. And then in the driving of delivery and in the routines, the way we set up the stock takes is the first year or two was spend a lot on reporting on delivery or outputs, and we made that distinction quite clearly, which is not the case in the delivery approach. And then, of course, as we put our data systems in place, we could start tracking outcomes as well. And we clearly distinguished, as I said, between the output and the outcome monitoring as we were reporting on these Gamechanger programs. So just to conclude with some of the lessons learned, yeah, so the Deliverology approach does suggest a few key indicators, but you know, because we were working with such complex social interventions, and I think you can agree when you look at things like reducing alcohol harms, e-learning, you can't just be working with a few indicators. So with projects of a more systemic nature, we did require a more comprehensive approach to performance tracking, and hence using program evaluation tools and approaches to strengthen almost the data collection and the monitoring of these Gamechanger programs. And as I've mentioned, the fact that we do have an established culture of M&E in the country, it meant that I had to think about, you know, what are the key concepts and terminology that our officials would be familiar with. The delivery approach uses different terms, have different meanings to those terms, and I had to kind of standardize it to fit the South African context. Then the issue of resource and expertise. Yes, you know, just the capabilities and competencies around data meant that ideally within the delivery approach, they actually suggest that your implementing departments collect the data, analyze the data, but that was not feasible within our context. And a lot of that performance tracking work was then subsequently done by the delivery support unit, which of course was not originally the plan. And that of course brings the risk that there could be an over-reliance on a delivery unit, because you know, a lot of the data elements were developed and run from our office. And at the end of the Gamechanger period, we kind of had to you know, have conversations with the departments in terms of how are you going to, or can you take this performance tracking forward? And of course, that wasn't always possible. So just in conclusion, the delivery unit, you know, ended then, and the delivery approach ended in 2019 when Premier Zille's term of office came to an end. Premier Windy decided not, you know, didn't continue with the delivery approach. And, you know, that is to be expected. The delivery approach, as I said, it's usually something that your political leader decides they want to do and then drive. And that was then basically the choice of Premier Zille to, you know, to take it on, and that unit then didn't continue past 2019. So I'm going to stop here. I see there are some comments in the chat, but I'm going to stop here now for questions and any comments. Paul, so I'm handing over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Charline, for such a powerful presentation and very insightful. And of course, to see how powerful we can be able to contextualize an approach and make it work in our context, that I'm saying from UK to South African, with some degree of success based on the results that you highlighted. But at the same time, also to be aware of the challenges that we have in our institutional makeup, as just the last one about the Premier Wind deciding not to go ahead with the approach for whatever reasons. That's one of the challenges we might find from in a system like ours, where there's almost a clear line between those who have the knowledge and the know-how to do what needs to be done versus political leadership that has another political imperative. And they're constantly looking at one of the things that they look at is their term of office and decide how far will such an approach perhaps be able to achieve what I've promised or what have been mandated by political party. And of course, he is not here to tell us why, but we're constantly trying to read their minds to see what could be a possibility of a political leader deciding not to use an approach that seemingly has some positive experience that can be built upon, and hopefully that at some stage there's an uptick. But I would like at this stage to open up the floor to colleagues. Some of those questions have been on the chat box, some conversation going on there. but I'll recognize Simo now to go for it, and then the rest of the colleagues as we hear the responses, process your questions. Simo, over to you, short and focused.
Okay. Short and focused indeed, as what I will try to do. Good morning to you as our program director. Good morning to the presenters. A job well done, a job well done. I am energized and deeply encouraged by the work that the colleagues have been doing in the Western Cape. And I have a few questions, and I've jotted them so that I avoid tautology and long speeches. I will start with the last point that you raised as the program director about the political context within which such things, such programs, the Deliverology was implemented. And for a political science student like myself, I would have understood the discontinuation of the program if the ANC government had taken over in the Western Cape. I understand that researchers are not politicians, but researchers are well aware of the political context. If they are at liberty to reflect on this point in particular, they are at liberty to do so. But if they do not wish, it's okay. But these are the three questions, more direct questions to the work that they have been doing. Now, number one, how is Deliverology different from implementation studies? You did make reference, but I still need to understand this question better, or the issue better about how is Deliverology different from implementation studies. I'm a policy analyst by training and at master's level, and I know policy development and I know what policy implementation entails. Now, how is this different? How is Deliverology different from implementation studies? Two, the implementation of Deliverology in the Western Cape super, as it within the context of the Department of Economic Development. And I'm working in the Department of Economic Development in KwaZulu-Natal. And I'm now interested in finding out, taking this to scale in our own province, but understanding also that KwaZulu-Natal is not the Western Cape. So context matters. Any comments on that? Number three, the issue of Deliverology and its 6 strategic priorities. I think that's the comment I would like to make. I think those, are these priorities cast in stone, or provinces like Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal can come up with their own priorities in terms of what is it that should be their focus? And then lastly, can Deliverology be Africanized and decolonized? I'm raising this question because I'm an African. And you mentioned that Deliverology came from the UK, and there's a particular history between ourselves and the UK, which is that we must be very sensitive about. And I must explain what I mean by Africanization and decolonization. The simple answer to that is that context matters. As researchers, you know what that means. There's African political, African economic, and African social, and African socio-economic and socio-political context that we must take into consideration. So that is all that I wanted to say. And all the best with the work that you are doing, and congratulations with your PhD. Thank you very much. I'll turn off my my video.
Thank you so much, Simo. Those are very loaded questions, very, very powerful. Some of them can also be a PhD by themselves. But I wonder, Dr. Charline, do you want to respond to those, or should I take another round and then you'll respond to all questions at once? Which one would you prefer?
That's fine, Paul. I think take the other questions and then we'll address all of them at once.
All right, great. From my screen, I can see Tamlin. Would you go for it, Tamlin?
Yes, hi, thanks, and thank you, Dr. Mouton. That was a very inspiring presentation. I shared one question with the past speaker, actually two. I was curious as to why the subsequent premier didn't continue with the approach. I'm also interested in, like Simo asked, how are the priorities decided on? What's the process for, and who is involved in deciding on those priorities? But then in particular, I'm also interested in your delivery units. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about how the 13 of you were selected. How were you recruited, and what was your sort of skill set? I'm just wondering if is it all professionals, or are civil society allowed to, or are they, is it thought to be beneficial to have activists on that, in those units? So thanks very much. Those are my questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tamlin. Let's go to Zondi Sbongeleni.
Greeting, Paul, and greeting to Doc. Thank you very much for presentation. I must applaud the work that has been done, similar to what the previous colleagues has done. But just to say that my question is also around the issue of prioritization, because we know that in South Africa we have the medium-term strategic framework that is set at the national level, that all the provinces must try and link to. So it will be very interesting on how, and I think maybe tap into the previous question, how the how the Western Cape were able to do it. But also I must just say and say I applaud the fact that it's done. I think the leadership, mostly at political and administratively, must take responsibility of setting this priority, because the important thing that we all need to embrace is that the resources in which we work with are very much limited. So at all times when we have administration, decision must be made, especially with South Africa as a country. What are we going to start with, and how does what we start with link to where we want to go to? So I am not opposed to the issue of prioritization. In fact, that's what South Africa needs to be doing, because we can't do all things, you know. And I think you guys will recall that the issue of a flag made a very huge thing around the country. And it's a big question whether our leadership is sensitive to the needs of the people on the ground. So the issue of prioritization is very important. But I just want to come to the issue of the delivery unit as well, because I think it would be good if Doc can expand on the delivery unit in the context of what we may understand it to be within South Africa and government. So that's one. What are these delivery units, and what is their what are their role? But also, how are these delivery units linked to the board monitoring and strategic unit in each of the other departments? Are there linkages between the two, or this delivery unit then takes over for the whole province, or then the work that is done by each of the monitoring unit in each department links to the delivery unit? Those would be my question, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bongeleni, for such insightful questions. And of course, the flag one, we never have a dull day in our nation. We could be we'll be planning to spend almost R1 million+ to put up a gold flag post. Can you believe it? Anyways, leave it at that. Charline, would you go for it? Whichever way you'd want to. I recognize a Nick. I will come back to you in the second round. All right, thank you. Over to you, Charline.
Great, thank you everyone for those questions. I am going to ask my colleagues, Belinda and Jenny, to also step in, where they want to add. So I'll address some of the questions, and then maybe Jenny, I'll ask you to come in on some of the more high-level questions around the issues of prioritization and, the kind of more the political context in terms of continuing with the delivery unit, not continuing, because I mean that that is something that I think Jenny is best placed to answer. But just your first question, Simo, in terms of how is deliverology really different from implementation sciences and implementation in general. So I just want to take you back. I think the slide where we speak about the fact that the delivery approach really is about a lot of elements coming together. So with pure implementation, of course, you would be having your implementation plans, you would be having your resources, you would have your indicators that you're tracking. I mean, that's kind of common around, the common features of implementation if you talk very broadly about it. But the delivery approach really brings together more elements than simply having a plan and tracking that plan consistently and, course correcting where necessary. So I think the additional elements of the delivery approach is very much around that political commitment, the issues of prioritization that all of you picked up on, the fact that you are really relentlessly almost for a number of years focusing on a number of priorities, and just to say that it is never meant to be infiltrated into the whole of government, this kind of approach. It's too resource intensive. So just to link to some of the other questions around the medium-term strategic framework and the priorities from national, you're always going to have that in the province. You're always going to have that direction in terms of what is national government wanting provinces to do. This is a provincial decision, and that addresses one of the other questions. This is a provincial decision around what are the priorities for our province? What is the things that our citizens in the province view as issues? For example, we know that the Western Cape has got an alcohol problem, and that is why we focused on that. We know that the Western Cape, have issues with energy. Well, everyone had it, but at that stage, it was still the load shedding was coming and going, but we decided that was a priority we wanted to take on as a province. So the selection of those priorities came very much from the provincial leadership, the executive, the ministers, with the Premier deciding these are things we are going to pull up a level in terms of really focusing on and honing in on. So no, it's not priorities that would stretch across all provinces. It is a province specific that one would decide what priorities you want to focus on. So so deliverology is different from normal implementation in that, you're convening every 2 months around these priorities, and you are putting dedicated teams behind it, and you are putting very specific effort into getting the required data. Those are not things that happen for all implementation work. Like I say, it's the fact that you've got your very strong leadership focus on this. So there's a number of key features that I think are definitely in addition to what you would find in just kind of your normal implementation work in government. As I said, Linda and Jenny can elaborate on that. In terms of the delivery unit, I'm also going to actually ask Jenny or Belinda to speak to that, but the delivery unit staff, some of them came from government. So like myself, I was seconded from economic development. Belinda also came from government. She was in the policy and sector department. Jenny was the Premier's advisor on the green economy. She took on the lead. She was actually our head of the delivery unit. We also recruited people from the outside. We had people come in from private sector. Our alcohol harms reduction lead came from the alcohol industry. In terms of just broader civic participation, activists, in developing the delivery plans, we had design labs where civic society was invited to join. We had a 6-month process of design labs. It very much follows the Operation Pakisa. If you think about Operation Pakisa and those intense sessions called design labs, we followed that same approach to get different players involved in developing the plans to make sure that those plans were representative of different stakeholders' interests and to obviously get them to help execute. That's the other thing. It wasn't just government implementing. In the after school Gamechanger, we had a huge number of NGOs participating. So the Gamechanger programs really wasn't just implementing from a government perspective. And by the way, that's another kind of, I think, element that's maybe particular to deliverology. It really works in getting other partners and other stakeholders to bring resources as well. So in terms of our involvement with the M&E or strategy departments of the implementing departments, yes, so when we were developing again the plans, those people would be involved. But just to say that, you know, these units have got their own very specific departmental work. They've got to monitor their own departments. They've got to develop the strategies for their own departments. So they weren't as involved in the day-to-day running of the Gamechanger programs, because they already had their workload, their priorities, but they were pulled in at points where necessary. You know, obviously they were collecting data so in e-learning, you can imagine a lot of WCED or education data we could use from what was produced by the Western Cape Education Department already. But we didn't expect them to be as involved because we knew that they had their own priorities. Okay, I'm going to just, if it's okay, Paul, just ask Jenny or Belinda to add, and then we can take the next round.
Yes, please. They can go ahead.
Do you want me to come in?
Yes,
Sorry,
thanks, Jenny.
I'm looking at you at the right angle. Hold on.
You are.
Wait, I'm just getting there. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay. Thanks very much, Charlene, and for those questions. The questions were really insightful and tough, actually, because they get to the crux of some of the issues. You know, you raised the issue of why, particularly within the same political party, you wouldn't get an Alan Winde following on from a Helen Zille and changing things. He never ever explained why. So I'll, you know, be quite frank, no one, we can only surmise, and one can only give certain, make certain comments, but then there's certainly not reasons why this happened, because we don't know. He never stated why. He didn't just change a delivery unit, he changed the entire department. He got rid of actually everybody. It was a real clean sweep. But I think if you look at the delivery approach, it takes a particular leader who wants to really adopt it and follow it. It deals with a lot of detail, rigor, data, evidence, and the leader that really attaches to this is someone who really usually pays attention to that kind of data and that kind of detail. And as you know, many politicians don't. So if they're not paying attention and they're not accepting the methodology, it is quite difficult to get leaders to then respond in the appropriate way. And the response you need from leaders is actually quite critical, because you are changing the way government works. You are shifting a focus. You are really dislodging an awful lot about the way people work in government. So you're not accepting the long time frames. You're expecting very quick responses. You're expecting a high levels of accountability. There's a whole range of issues that doesn't exist very often in the public sector. So it's very hard. So there is a lot of kickback, and very often when people start seeing results, the kickback gets less, but many people just can't adjust to the different way of working. So a delivery unit never sits fully comfortably in a government. I think if anybody expects it to, then one's got the wrong idea about it. You're there to push very hard for change on very critical issues that need to be done. And so there's always this kind of difficulty. Now, you will all know the personality, the public persona of a Helen Zille. She doesn't mind being controversial, so she doesn't mind taking hard positions. She doesn't mind kickback. So she didn't mind the fact that people might have go to her and complain about a delivery unit pushing them too hard or demanding too much from them, etc. So she was quite comfortable with that. As a government leader, she's quite different to what you see on the public platform. She's very methodical. She listens. She takes on the detail. So she's problem solving. So she's got that component. So it fitted very well with her as she governed. And it fitted, as somebody I saw in the comments, to quite of a command. It can have quite a command and control. It doesn't always, but she's got that kind of level. And so she made sure it happened. Alan Winde, on the other hand, is somebody who's not a detailed person. And also, I suppose you could say Mr. Nice Guy. And I don't think it sat very comfortably that you had this very strong, assertive approach towards getting things done on certain high priorities. And he had different ideas of how he wanted to do things. So you're going to hit that, and that's always the case for a delivery unit. and this delivery approach. The first thing governments always ask on delivery is, you know, you need to institutionalize it. Well, sometimes you don't. If we look at the current South African situation, there are just some huge, big problems you need to solve. You don't need to get involved in whether you're going to have have an institution available that's going to stay beyond those problems. You might just need a special arrangement of implementation or delivery just to solve those problems. And so, you know, don't get too hung up on whether it should last or not. It just depends on the circumstances. One's got to be quite flexible depending on what one's dealing with. If we look at current day South Africa, there's a very good case for just saying you have a very strong, good delivery capability mobilized and get some of these big problems we have solved. And then later you can start looking at more longer term institutional arrangements. So that depends. The issue of context and Africanization and decolonize approach to this deliverology, it's all about context. I have to say there are basic principles to delivery that cover everybody. If somebody thinks they can rewrite delivery principles of just how to get things done, it covers everybody. The way you want to implement them, the way you want to put this approach in play, that will differ from country to country, to continent to continent. So Charline and I went to the United States, and I think it was in Baltimore. If you looked at the presentation, they had a delivery unit, and the way they managed it, they did it in a very American approach. It's quite combative. It's very, it's almost competitive. That the person was grilled by the political leadership who was responsible for a project. Whereas we in the delivery unit and the stock takes, we said, this is a problem-solving forum. We're not here to blame people. That's not what we want to be doing. And so you got a very different approach. Then this has been very successful in Malaysia, in Pakistan, across the world. But in some, you've had highly command and control. And you might say that suits the context of a country better, very, very controlling of the whole process by political leaders. And in others, a much more consultative approach. So you have to take in place the culture of governments, the culture of societies, the context, the level of development, what the problems you're dealing with. So, you know, in the West, you know, and the developed economies, they've got already a high level of capability. In a South African case, for example, where the state of capability within the governments is very low very often, not in all cases, but in very cases, the capability of the state is low, you might be focusing on some different issues, much more around a project management than you might do in a developed country, because the project management capability is already there. So you've got to be quite flexible, and you've got to be open to the circumstances, not just culture, not anything, but also capability, skills, resources. All of those come into play when you design how you want to work with this. And I think but it's hard everywhere. You know, we're working at the moment with a huge global multilateral organization, and masses of high-level capability doesn't take away that changing the way you work and getting results in very big bureaucratic organizations is really, really hard. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. I wonder if you wanted to say, just, I don't know about our time, Paul, but I wonder if Jenny just maybe wanted to say something about the delivery unit, and, you know, just the way that we were kind of organized, and how we got the right people, and, you know, what that took. Jenny, if you can just
maybe, please go ahead.
Is that all right? Is that all right, Paul?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Yeah, all right. Well, what happened was that, ironically, this was triggered by Trevor Manuel speaking to Helen Ziller, saying you really should get a delivery unit going. And it never became public, but the presidency, a little bit before we started one, had actually looked at having a delivery unit. And I've just seen that recently from documentation in the presidency. But basically, so she went off and she looked at it and she said, this is very, very reasonable approach, and decided to do it. So basically, we engaged with Michael Barber, But we went ahead without, first of all, we just read what was done. So we just got started and engaged with Michael Barber and looked at the fact that the cabinet, a whole lot of priorities were put on the table. And there were some different priorities to what you see. There were some, for example, like sanitation, which we really wanted to do because we felt that with informal settlements, you couldn't solve all informal settlement problems at once and create formalized housing for everybody, but you could take a part of it and solve sanitation. But the city of Cape Town was the big player there, and they wanted to go a different approach. So something like sanitation fell off the list because we had to liaise with the city of Cape Town. So we went through this process. For example, the Better Living Model, the particular department that was responsible for that land didn't want it. They said it was impossible to do in the time frame. So you got kickback right in the beginning for some of them. And there were cabinet discussions, but obviously very broadly phrased. So that we needed to hone down the areas and develop the plans for each of these game changers. So we started off without a delivery unit. We started off with myself, Charline, who had been working with me on the green economy, and Belinda came in a little bit later. She'd taken a year off for studies. They then, we seconded people. So we started more with a seconded unit so we can get going very quickly. And then we got approval from Cabinet for the delivery unit plus those priorities. And then we were able to recruit. Now, in those days, it was a little bit easier because there was provision for what was called above the establishment appointments. So a government could take on some people on contract for a very specific job, and they could appoint them. However, that was abused countrywide. And so when there started to be an attempt to tighten up on all the problems within the public sector, that was removed. And we were just in time. So we were able to make very quickly the appointments that we needed for the delivery unit. So for example, the presidency today can't do that, believe it or not, what we could do to actually make the appointments that were needed. And we chose, we had an organogram. So we thought we'd start with an organogram. We had a team per game changer, and we had a little bit of cross-cutting activity. But what we found was, as we went along, there were two difficulties. Sometimes you can't get the skills, getting data skills, because we thought the assistants would all have data skills, is very hard. It's in short supply in South Africa. It's quite an expensive skill to get data analytics. So what we found was that, and we found that some of the game changers, you were going to the same, they were in education. 3 of them crossed education. And we found that it was better to have a centralized data under Charline, because then instead of going to the school 3 times for each, there are 3 game changers that were school relevant, we actually coordinated all the data for 3 game changers. So you went to the schools once, if you could, on certain issues. So surveys would encompass all 3 game changers, whereas if you did it in almost a game changer per game changer and not as cross-cutting, we would have been actually having to almost overload the schools with demands, because you would have had 3 teams coming with demands on the schools and the education department and districts. And since Charline rather coordinated that, and it's one of the real strengths of delivery units is a coordinating strength, whether you're doing it internally as a team or you're doing it with governments. This coordinating requirement is something you look at quite closely. And therefore we changed our structure for the delivery unit to really have a much stronger cross-cutting, coordinating side. And I think that worked really well. And if we look at governments today, their big issue in South Africa is often they can't coordinate. There's lots of silos, there's lots of different demands. People are bombarded from different sides. So the idea of rather using a central point is not for command and control so much, but as to more effectively and efficiently coordinate what you need. And that is quite difficult to achieve, because people often feel that what's coming is a command and control approach. So the delivery unit, we kept it small, and that's what tends to be the pattern as well. And so we didn't think too much about it. We just got going, and then we did, I think, what we then, as we got going, what we felt was sensible. So I suppose a principle is not to be very rigid. You've got to be very open-minded when you do this work, but you've also got to be very clear about what you want to achieve. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. And thank you so much, Jenny, for that. Really appreciate that. Looking at the time constraints, Charline, would you just briefly go into Tamlin's question, a kind of skill set that you have to put together? I think part of our answer has been answered by Jenny about the Deliverology.
Yeah, I think it's done.
But just a little bit, Charline, on the skill set of the team.
Yeah, so we actually ended up developing, you know, when we were advertising, I think quite a good kind of skill set analysis of the different team members. But as I said, you know, we really focused on people who had a can-do attitude. I cannot actually underscore that enough. You are looking for people who can think a little bit differently. We always say someone who's curious, you know, someone who doesn't just accept the norm, but also someone who had an understanding of government. I do think that's an important, and that's why our delivery unit consisted of government officials and outside people, because you have to have an understanding of government and be sensitive to almost the constraints of government. You know, you can't come in from the outside and then expect that you can change the world, and you know that government doesn't have restrictions. So I think we were quite mindful of those restrictions and tried to operate as effectively as we could within the constraints of the bureaucracy. So I think that mix of skill sets between people who have worked in government, who understand government, as well as then some outside people who kind of triggered the innovation and brought different ways of thinking, was I think a very good combination of the people we ultimately had in the unit. So yeah, so I think that for me was I hope that addresses your question, Tamlin.
Okay, all right. I would like to give Anik an opportunity to ask a question, and please do so. And then we'll go again to, there's also another question that I would like you to respond to that is on our chat box. Yeah, but let's do that first, and then we'll come back. And then after that, I'll give Simo another chance. All right. Anik, please go for it.
Thanks, Paul. But firstly, thanks, Charline, for your insightful presentation. I think it covered a lot of the areas that I've basically been grappling with in terms of deliverology. So basically, M&E in its current form within government is very mechanistic, and you basically highlighted that. And you know, people's approach to it is, well, it's an administrative responsibility, and therefore, you know, somebody in some corner of the organization is taking responsibility for just getting all of this together and then submitting, and we tick a box. What your approach is saying is that, you know, there should be a focus on how do we, as a department, you know, instead of having these vertical silos, have these horizontal interactions and horizontal kind of ways of solving problems within the organization. And you mentioned that within your presentation, you know, horizontal implementation. Is that across department, or is that just across priorities, is my question, because it's important to kind of understand that, because Jenny's response was having a central unit focusing on delivery allowed for, you know, taking 3 priorities within one organization. And I come from Western Cape Education Department as well, responsible for strategy, research, and policy. So, so that's important. The other thing is also around target setting and how that is done. There's a science to it, but it's also quite a complex environment to navigate. And how did you deal with target setting as it relates to SDGs, the NDPs, and all of these other kind of 10-point plans of the organization. And Jenny said you didn't focus so much on the culture because that in itself, but how did you enable change though for people to kind of come on this journey? Because that's an important part, because a priority or strategy is only as strong as its capability and culture, and therefore I'm quite interested in understanding that. And then the last one, sorry for taking up so much time, but the last one is, a whole of society approach, or kind of WOSA approach, where, a key is your municipalities, the community at large, and taking a UXD or a user experience design approach to understand how users actually use the service to design for an approach or a delivery. So thanks for that, and for the opportunity to ask these questions.
Right, thank you so much, Nick. While Charline, you're still processing the response for Nick's question, I'd like to pick up a question from the chat box that Hanim has asked. Maybe Hanim is here. Anyway, would you go ahead and ask the question instead of me reading it? Hi, Hanim, can you hear me? Okay, let me just then read it because it's already posted there. It says, how does one contribute to the development of a more positive culture of data sharing and greater earnest in using data as an imperative as an imperative element in planning? So it's about data sharing and how do you motivate that as an imperative for planning. Then there was another question around how can a person in the middle management level sustain a positive mindset and stay focused on the right action? Wow. Okay. That sounds like something. And then the very last question is from Simo, because I see time is really not on our side and it's very interesting. Simo,
yes, one question.
Yes.
And I'd like to apologize. I'll leave at 10:30 because there's another engagement. Is it Janine or Jenny who was responding? Jenny. Okay. I have a follow-up question, but before that, there's a comment that as public officials and as public policy analysts and government employees, we try to not attach any and all emotion to public policy making. But I must put it on record in this meeting that the decision by the Premier Wendy was at best, a poor decision and at worst disheartening, really disheartening. That's all I'm prepared to say for now on that. My 2 cents worth of thinking around this is that which I can say. Now, the question that I would like to ask as a follow-up is, was politics ever a consideration in your decision-making as a delivery unit in the province? I'm raising this question within the context of the comment you made about the work around the city of Cape Town and the sanitation story. And I'm raising it because you know about Khayelitsha, you know about Maphumelele and places like Philippi, and the issue of data and the need for proper water and sanitation in those areas. Was politics ever a decision-making issue? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Simo. Maybe Charline, you probably want to start with Simo's question so at least he can get some response while he's still on the platform, and then we can take the others. Yes. All right, go for it, Charline.
Yeah, I think maybe, Jenny, do you mind responding to Simo's question first, just given his time constraint? And then I can take the rest of the questions.
Yeah, Simo, it's quite a difficult question. Was politics involved? I suppose you're always having to be cognizant of political relationships, and even if the same political parties exist between different tiers of government, there is still quite a lot of contestation. You know, people feel that they didn't want the Western Cape government necessarily intruding where they felt it was their domain if you're local government. And equally, you've got the contestation with national government of their spheres of influence over the provincial spheres of influence. So there's always a lot of sensitivity around that, and how to manage it and build the relationships that enable that. And I think the building of the relationships is really important. Mm-hmm. On the sanitation, the City of Cape Town had it was just a different view. They said they were going to take what they called a full sort of developmental systemic approach. So they didn't want to carve out just a piece of the problem like sanitation, and they would rather look at the full development of a whole informal settlement. And my argument was, well, we wouldn't interfere with what was on your IDP. You know, that if you've got a 3-year plan, you've got a whole lot of informal settlements you are going to develop. They're already in line, but there's also informal settlements that have been there for 10 years. They're not on the next 3-year plan of an IDP, and they need to get attention. And it was a different viewpoint, as opposed to, I think, necessarily political, but the politics could have been, what are you doing on our turf? We decide these things. So it was never articulated, but I agree with you, one's got to be quite sensitive, and the relationships you have with people are really important. So what's interesting is that because of the green economy work, we had been doing quite a lot of work already with the City of Cape Town, other municipalities around energy, and there was what we called an SPV, which is now an independent, very well respected national NGO now, Green Cape. That was very, and we built up a lot of relationships with that. And so when we were looking at doing energy didn't get that same kind of kickback because we had relationships already established. And so which we didn't have in that area of informal settlements, informal housing, and in terms of sanitation. And that might have been a factor. If we'd had previous relationships, we might have actually been able to push this forward. And so it does show that we haven't really touched very much on it, but the building of relationships in order to do this work is really quite critical. And one example for, when we hit our near day zero, as you know, with the drought in the Western Cape, it took, because the water, all the different people responsible for water hadn't had those relationships. It took them some months, even though it was a crisis, to get themselves organized in a way that when the energy crisis hit again, it didn't happen with energy. Very quickly there was a cabinet meeting, and within 2 days, the energy people could have a response to load shedding, how they might respond, Eskom there, everything all organized, because we had everything in place, all the relationships, we had an understanding of all the issues. And so the ability to be responsive to issues even outside of the game changers was far stronger. And so I think it's one of the side benefits of working with this approach, is that you do build very strong relationships with departments, with governments, and that one should focus on that, so that when those outlast the particular priority, which is very important. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay,
it does. Thank you very much. It does. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simo. So I think, just to quickly address Anik's questions or comments. I think to start with the kind of delivery mindset and culture change issue, just to say that we realized how big an issue this was as we were implementing this approach. And to be quite honest, we, obviously in our reflections with Michael Barber, because we had them supporting us as we started, we did feel that the change management issue wasn't tackled efficiently in the delivery approach. And I think within the context of our government and probably other governments, it is definitely something that should be part and parcel of the delivery approach, is really that change management element. How do you deal with, with your restrictions around silos, just the whole mentality.
And change of leadership.
Exactly. So that is something that was definitely a shortcoming of the delivery approach, which we obviously in our work now going forward in our consultancy is something that we pay a lot more attention to, by the way, and seeing how one actually deals with that issue. So just around your questions around the kind of, prioritization, was it, or whether it was across departments or across priorities. So look, the fact that we were always focused on the priority. So we were always, when we're doing our stock tags, we were reporting on e-learning. And then we had a stock tag for after school. We had a stock tag for apprenticeships. Even though they were all three educational in nature, what we started doing, because there was then obviously an overlap in people attending those three stock tags. So from education department, you'll have 3 or 4 people that needed to sit in on all 3 of those stock tags every time. So we just started scheduling them to kind of flow from each other, to be in sequence, so that, in terms of just getting the right people to attend, that we could have that. So there's not, there isn't really another way to do it, because the emphasis always remained on the strategic priority, and reporting on each of those priorities meant that different people had to come together, and you would always have that overlaps of departments. That, that is just the way that our Game Changer programs were run. You had DDAT, economic development, having to attend energy and apprenticeships, education attending 3 of those. So you always had that that overlap of departments, and it was just creating that platform through the stock tags to make sure that the right people were in the room. I mean, that's how we did it. But as Jenny said, through the delivery unit, you could add almost that Uber kind of lens of coordination. So on the data front, under the communication, when we did the communication strategy, we could apply that even a level higher. So for all the educational game changers, we could look at the communications as a collective and say, how do we approach this from the data side? How do we approach to collect the data as a collective on the educational game changers? So that's where that extra coordination or Uber coordination function was really useful from a delivery unit perspective. Target setting, yeah, we never went into seeing how our targets and programs aligned to the NDP SDGs. Our target setting were really at the program levels. So really looking at, these were the programs we were rolling out. On the outcome side, output side, how do we set targets that always pushes the boundaries just a little bit? So on the output side, it was easier. That was always informed by budget. That's your reality. You've got so much budget, you can do so much. But on the outcome side, and maybe with some of the outputs, not all of them, but maybe with some of them, you tried to be ambitious with your targets. And as I said, we didn't set outcome targets until such time as we had a baseline in place, because that would have just been a complete thumb suck exercise. So that's the way we approach target setting. And yeah, just obviously with many of our game changers, we did get, like I said, districts involved. In the e-learning game changers, I had numerous sessions with district staff, went to see schools, met with schools in each district. We really, I think, went that level lower in terms of reaching out to the various people, and then also forming part of the design phase as well. We did also bring in design thinking with some of our game changer programs. The positive culture of data, I don't have, unfortunately, huge new insights there. All I can say is that what really helped with data on our side is that people started getting excited about the data when they really understood the value of granular data. So when we started getting that data in, and it took a huge amount of effort to collect that granular level of data, but it started paying off. People were asking, why are we collecting this? It started paying off when the reporting on it started happening, and people could see how we were using the data to take corrective action. So the value of the data was almost demonstrated only once you start doing it. And I guess that is the kind of comment I could just say on data, is that it's only once you have it and you start realizing the value of it. So it's very difficult and you can't in government do that granular level of data collection. It is impossible. But in the Game Changer program, I really think it did start shifting some kind of mindset. I don't know if Jenny, if you wanted to add on that, but yeah, in terms of sustaining and kind of how this panned out in future, a lot of the Game Changer programs were, like I said, already featuring in government departments. So there is in economic development, there was an energy unit. There was in economic development a skills program. Obviously in education, a huge e-learning team. So in terms of sustaining the results, I can't comment on whether the results have been sustained, but there has been definitely positive results. We never had an external evaluation done. We felt that the fact that the delivery unit was outside of these departments did give that element of objective oversight. So we didn't it didn't warrant, in our view, another layer of evaluation needing to be done. And by virtue of tracking over time, you could pick up that we're looking at things like, obviously, our quality of data. Because you've got that consistent data collection, you could pick up immediately where there were issues. So I do think we had that kind of objectivity just by virtue of the delivery unit being outside of the departments. And then I think that addresses most of the issues or questions that were raised. So yeah, I think, Paul, back to you. Thanks, Anik.
Thank you so much, Charline, and thank you, Jenny, for responding to those questions. Really very insightful. Somebody is asking, is it possible for you to share your presentation? So you can email it to Tamlin and I, and we'll share it with our colleagues. It's really very, very insightful, and I think it's just that time is not on our hands. We could have really delved into other aspects of the presentation, and I'm sure there could be still more lingering questions, but we'll leave it there for now. Sensitive for your time, also knowing that you needed to be on your way. Other than that, thank you so much on behalf of KZN MEL Network and our members, those who are here and those who couldn't make. We really appreciate for your time and to come and engage with us. And we hope this is the first of the many times we'll be seeing you often, even as an attendee now and then, if you permit us to share with us our itinerary, and so that you can be able to plug in. We really would like to tap into your wisdom now and then as we grapple with this. And some of our colleagues on the platform also from different government departments, and I'm sure it's just because of our time limitation, they could have probably also had chance to ask a few questions, depending on the context that they deal with. But be as it may, I think we have really, really enjoyed the presentation, very insightful, and to, of course, grappling with the difficulties of institutionalizing an approach, bearing in mind the different factors that we have to navigate on, like the political culture, political leadership, the capacities of different departments, the intercoordination approach to make sure that the approaches such as this one are also contextualized and institutionalized and be supported to the extent they can deliver, they can facilitate the delivery of services, public goods and services to the expectation of citizens. So it's a very powerful concept, I think, and an approach that can trigger a lot of good governance related questions that can help us to move forward. So we wish you well, Charline. Have a very great time. Enjoy and say hi to your dad.
Well.
All right. And